Well, hello everybody. My name is Aaron Ford and I am your Attorney General. Welcome to the first episode of State of Justice. I am so happy to be here and so happy to be kicking off this new program that we're going to be running here at the Office of Attorney General. I even discussed this with my kids and let them know that I was going to try to do some millennial type work, or are they millennials right now? Are they Gen Z? I don't know, whatever they are. All I know is that they kind of giggled at me and told me that they thought I could do a good job, so we shall see. My first episode of this program is going to be with a guest who is none other than my Chief of Staff, Teresa Benitez-Thompson. We call her affectionately TBT. She's going to be joining me a bit later in the show to discuss representing Nevada as part of the United States delegation to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, something that I was able to participate in a couple of months ago, and very much looking forward to that discussion with her. But first, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a complaint that I received from a concerned resident in a segment that we call Publicly Speaking. So earlier this year, our office received a complaint from a citizen concerned about the fundraising tactics of a local nonprofit. I'll read a short excerpt from her complaint. She says, "I'm writing to bring your attention to a letter I received from someone asking for a charitable donation for a Nevada nonprofit organization. Based on the contents of the letter, I believe this organization is engaged in fraudulent fundraising practices by making provably wrong statements for the purpose of raising money. I'm asking your office to investigate this complaint." She goes on to say that please honor your commitment to your 5 C's, one of which is consumer protection. Soliciting money from kind-hearted donors by providing false information is taking advantage of the public. It's unethical, unscrupulous, and deceptive, is what she says. So listen, this is for everybody out there. I really appreciate it when constituents write to my office about one of our 5 C's. It lets me know that my mission and that my vision for this office is getting across to the people. In this particular incident, my investigators received this complaint and they really did their due diligence to determine the best course of action to determine 3 things. First of which they saw that they were looking to see if a crime or unlawful act was being committed. They also checked to see if our agency, our Office of Attorney General, is the right entity to pursue the complaint, and if so, how we can best serve the interest of the general public. In order to do that, evidence had to be gathered, and what investigators were able to find is that the nonprofit organization was indeed using a third-party vendor to send out fundraising solicitations, and this vendor made those inaccurate statements as a marketing technique. And so once our investigators spoke to the head of the nonprofit, they were able to enter what's called an assurance of voluntary compliance, which is essentially a legalese, a legal term for promising to clean up their act. We didn't need to arrest anyone or to take them to court to rectify this situation, and it all started with a concerned citizen reaching out to my office, and we were able to get this addressed. So if you come across some activities that you think may be unlawful, you can always submit a complaint with my office. We may not always be the right agency to pursue your complaint, but we can do everything that we can to make sure that you have your issue addressed, even if it's to refer you to another agency. Now, let me move on to introducing our first guest of our podcast series. It is TBT, Teresa Benitez-Thompson. She is a longtime Reno resident who is familiar to many as the former Assembly Floor Majority Leader in the Nevada State Legislature. During her elected tenure, Teresa was a proud member of the 80th legislative session, which was a historic one because it produced the nation's very first female majority legislature. So thanks for joining me. I want to have you on my first episode, TBT, so that we can discuss the U.S. delegation to the United Nations, because this podcast was sort of your brainchild, and also because you and the communication staff worked very hard with the State Department staff to prep me for that meeting in Geneva.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to join you. And I will say that I don't mean to put more work on your plate by saying, let's talk about this, let's do this podcast and let's tell the state of Nevada about all of the things that the Attorney General office does. But it really is amazing the breadth of different issues, the breadth of conversations and topics that come before the office, and all the different things you work on. I don't think that the community or the state quite realize all the different things an attorney general has to do. And so on top of being the chief law enforcement officer for the state of Nevada, you also get called upon by other entities to talk about kind of the state of justice and the state of law in Nevada. And recently one of those entities was the State Department. And so how cool to get an email to say that you are invited to be part of a formal U.S. delegation to the United Nations to talk about human rights.
Yeah,
so just
really
first of all,
else.
like, what was it like to get that email and know that you were only one of 2 non-federal persons allowed to travel on this trip?
Yeah, well, I've learned a long time ago that I am not the boss of me, and so TBT, I want to thank you for bringing this up and for spearheading this podcast. And to your point, though, to get that email and to get that call from the Department of State asking me to be, as you said, one of only 2 non-federal delegates to the United Nations in Geneva to testify on behalf of our country's compliance, or lack thereof sometimes, with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was an honor of a lifetime. I was floored and frankly just kind of wondered how they even got my name. And so, I asked and they said, because frankly, it was the work that we were doing in this office. It has made national headlines relative to the work that we do in focusing on justice and on what they knew were my 5 C's. And so it was great to get it. And we began immediately preparing for what proved to be a very difficult 3 days of answering questions of not just members of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, but also of entities from the United States and elsewhere, civil society as they were called, on whether we had been complying with the International Covenant.
And I thought that was a really interesting way that the civil society groups engaged and held conversations and asked questions. First of all, that term civil society, I think, is significant because it is a place to have discourse about really hard questions about where people are making progress or not making progress on these really important issues. And they did not go easy on people watching,
not at all.
being up at the comms team and I being up at 2 or 3 in the morning while you guys are meeting in Geneva. They asked a lot of tough questions. And so how did that feel being on that side in that setting, being asked about everything from, all aspects of justice reform, all aspects of civil and political rights? Yeah,
look, being in public service, whether it's at the federal level or the state level or local level, it's exactly that. It's public service, and it's an opportunity, and in fact, an obligation to serve the public and to be as forthright as you can about efforts you've undertaken, successes you've had, but also failures that you've had. And so, listening to these organizations ask questions about whether we have, for example, been supportive of women's health rights, and having to answer questions about what recent Supreme Court cases look like and how that reflects on whether we do in fact believe in the civil and political rights of our citizens, was an important conversation to be had, and it was a difficult one because this is on the tail end, as you know, of, for example, a Supreme Court case that has decided that women no longer have the right to decide with their bodies what they want to do, a lot of the people asking us questions, not just from civil service, but also from members of the Human Rights Committee, viewed that decision as being non-compliant with the actual international covenant. They asked questions about our treatment of indigenous people in our country. We even had folks from civil society who were members of recognized tribes asking us about how our country can say that we are in fact complying with the covenant when we still have strained relations with so many of them. Those are some of the examples of the tough questions that we had to undertake.
And it was really, I thought, a great example of watching those type of groups speak truth to power, which I've heard you talk about a lot, that even as Attorney General, you still feel like it's your job to speak truth to power. And there was a lot of candor in the responses that came across. There was a lot of acknowledgement of, hey, here's where we've made progress, but also here's the work we have left to do. And so it wasn't necessarily all through rose-colored glasses. You were pretty succinct and pretty honest about, especially in Nevada, the fights that we have in front of us.
Right, and you have to be, right, because our country is considered and oftentimes touts itself as a leader in the world when it comes to protecting human rights, and so to answer specific questions about how some of the actions that our politicians take in this country actually reflect upon that leadership is important, and again, I viewed it as an opportunity to speak truth to power. From my position of power, talking about, again, our successes, but also our failures and our shortcomings, and how we have to continue to strive to get better and to respect the civil and political rights of everyone in our country.
There were a lot of questions. They seem to really focus in a lot on justice reform, policing reform.
That's right.
That's obviously been a topic that's very important to you. Did you feel, I guess, as the questions were being asked and as you were preparing your responses, did you feel like you were in a spot where you got to talk about Nevada a little bit differently, perhaps, than other states might have talked about themselves? I mean,
absolutely. Look, in our state, we have made some great strides, and specifically to the issue of police reform, for example. And that touches on civil rights, to be sure, right? It's the government and its interaction with the people who are under their control, so to speak. And so, being able to talk about the fact that, for example, in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, you were in the legislature at the time.
I was,
and you all passed laws that increased reporting requirements, that got rid of the ability to use chokeholds, right? That helps us to track police officers who are transferred or moved to different departments, and talking about that in the context of what we were able to do as Attorney General, as Attorney General office, to pursue legislation that ultimately passed with your help unanimously, right? We were able to limit the use of no-knock warrants in our state, which was something that we have learned has been misused on occasion, and certainly has led to problems, not the least of which is the unfortunate killing of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yeah.
And so we were able to get a bill passed that limits the use of those types of tactics in our state. And we were also able to be very responsive to what happened in George Floyd's murder by giving this office, the Attorney General's office, under my control at the time, and currently, obviously, the right to investigate police departments who are alleged to be engaging in discriminatory practices against certain segments of our population. And so, again, these were efforts that we were undertaking to ensure that we could comply with the civil rights that our Constitution requires governments to protect vis-a-vis their interactions with our residents.
And the office keeps working towards those goals. I think most notably, you were able to secure a position in this past legislative session for patterns and practice work. So to be able to actually get a dedicated attorney to be able to look at patterns and practices and police enforcement and engagement in communities. And also, the office has just released a report on a use of force report as well. So there's movement on the fronts that still continue under your leadership in this office.
Yeah, that's right. It's not just about talking about it. It's not just about putting a law on the books. It's about utilizing the law and ensuring that we are, again, doing all that we can to protect the civil rights of the residents of the state. We have hired someone now who is overseeing our department that can investigate police departments to the extent they are violating rights. And that's not to the exclusion of our own office, for example.
Yeah.
I purposefully, in that legislation, asked and committed our office to the voluntary oversight to the federal government relative to looking at our compliance with constitutional rights of other folks. And so I think that's an important note to make, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, not very many people, when they write such laws, include themselves. They're like,
we
want to make sure you all have accountability, and and oftentimes you can find that entity has written themselves out of the accountability that they're looking for other organizations.
Exactly.
But you stuck the Attorney General's office right in there.
Yeah, and again, being able to be in Geneva and talking about, from Nevada specific perspective, our efforts at complying with the covenant, even though the covenant is a concept that's directed at the country as a whole, we're able to talk about in our state what we are trying to do to comply with that.
Well, I thought, and I'm a little bit biased, but I tried to be objective. I thought you did a wonderful job. Those questions were hard-hitting questions. They were very long interview sessions, and you had. It felt like, how big was the delegation? It was
probably 3 dozen.
Yeah, 3 dozen
people or so.
Yeah, so 3 dozen people, all but 2 of which were federal people.
That's right.
And so you really actually almost saw yourself have to make sure you got your time in, because those federal agencies wanted to talk, but you wanted to make sure the state was heard. And so I was like, look at that, in Geneva, the state of Nevada is being heard.
Yeah, and the format was interesting because it wasn't someone asks a question and then someone answers the question. It was an hour-long session where members of the committee laid out like dozens of questions.
Yes.
And so we were feverishly taking notes as the delegation, and then we were given 45 minutes, maybe it was, I can't remember exactly, maybe 30, 45 minutes to go back to our little room and then discuss among ourselves who was going to answer what particular question and how much time we were going to be given to answer those questions. And so then we would come back, and then the next hour would be spent answering those questions or being told, you didn't answer my question. And that was an important lesson as well, right? Because, stock answers don't do, right? You have to be able to come in.
They were not having it. They were not letting anyone.
They were somewhat, were sometimes impressed with the responses we gave, but they weren't entirely impressed with the answers that we gave. And especially in view of the fact that our country, again, touts itself and strives to be a leader in these areas, it was a very interesting interaction to have over in Geneva.
Okay. Any final words on the trip? We should say that in case for those who might ask it, that it was because you were a delegate and invited by the State Department. The State Department covered the cost of it.
That's right.
So it was the best kind of trip where you got to go and represent Nevada, but it was on the federal government's
That's
dime,
right.
not the taxpayer
No
Nevada's
Nevada taxpayer dollars were spent on this trip. That's I want you everybody to know that. This was the federal government that reached out to us and asked that our state be represented, because we are, from the federal government's perspective, a good representative of efforts at our compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. I didn't get to see much of Geneva. I left on Saturday, got there Sunday, and Monday, bright and early, we got to work. I did get to see, in the bus between the embassy to the UN headquarters, what some of Geneva looks like, that was cool. I can say this though, I did taste the chocolate. The chocolate is good in Geneva. It's real good. It's real good.
Is it all that it's hyped up to be, like, for real?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. And that Swiss chocolate and chocolate milk is also good, just so you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if I ever get there, I will have a cup of hot chocolate, just because you say so.
You should get there. You should absolutely check it out.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for letting me talk to you about that trip. I thought it was a very impressive showing for the state of Nevada to be involved in, and it was arduous, I know, for you to be able to have to travel and perform Attorney General duties really up until the minute you flew out, go and represent as part of this delegation, and then come right back and hit the ground running with more Attorney General duties.
Right.
So you're like an Energizer Bunny over there on some of this stuff.
Well, it didn't stop. I was up at 2 a.m. Geneva time, responding to emails and answering questions. And so I can't thank you enough, and our communications team, Arsenio and John, for helping to get me prepped on all of this. It was a fantastic experience, and I can't thank you enough for your support. So thank you again, TBT, for being our very first guest on our podcast here. And we want to thank everyone for tuning in. Our next show is going to be on a consumer protection related topic, and so tune in. I want you to also please consider sharing this, liking this podcast, and telling your friends and family about the podcast. And we are excited about that. Well, that is it for this episode of the State of Justice. Thank you again to TBT for joining me, and thank you all for listening. Be on the lookout for our next episode coming up soon.